We are following a developing story in Turkey where there's growing backlash over President Recep Erdogan's re-election victory. He now has sweeping new executive powers as he enters his second term.
Opponents have slammed Erdogan's win, saying it ushers in a one-man rule. He has been criticized for arresting journalists, judges, lawyers, and others speaking out against him over the past few years. For more on this, let's bring in CBSN contributor Alex Kliment. He writes for Signal, a newsletter produced by GZERO Media. Good to see you.
Good to be here, as always.
So it's just fascinating to me to watch Turkey's transformation over the last 10 or 15 years. 15 years ago, when I was still living in Europe, the Europeans thought of Turkey as like-minded, as a country embracing democratic ideals. There was even talk of bringing Turkey into the European Union. How far we've come.
Well, look, I mean, one of the things that Erdogan did was to shift the center of gravity in Turkish politics away from the secular elites who live in cities like Istanbul and who'd run the country for most of the period since 1923, and towards a new constituency of more religiously conservative people who live in the Anatolian heartland, small business owners rather than kind of big conglomerate owners. And over time, he kind of developed this more kind of quasi-Islamist, quasi-Turkish nationalist ideology that then kind of he needed to keep pushing and pushing and pushing in order to retain power, and that led him in a much more authoritarian direction. Of course, there was a coup against him in 2016. He responded to that coup by declaring a state of emergency, which gave him broad powers. He's fired tens of thousands of officials, purged them from the state ministries and so on, as you say, taking control of the media and marginalized his opponents. And yet, in the election this weekend, he still only got 52% of the vote. So what that tells me is that even for all of his move in a more authoritarian direction, underlying Turkish society is still unbent by his, I mean, there's still a lot of opposition to him, right? Still deeply polarized over his presidency. And there have been some protests against the vote. But still, to me, that 48% of the population voted against him and that his party, the AKP, didn't even win a majority tells me that under the surface there's a lot more ferment and polarization than you would be led to believe, just given the amount of power that he's concentrated.
Oh, that's an interesting observation. Still, even with all of this, even as we're watching Erdogan amass more power and change the laws so he can secure his position in power, Turkey's an important NATO ally. Can we expect any of that to change? Well,
the relationship with NATO has been kind of going down the tubes over the past couple of years, in particular as Turkey tries to carve out its own sphere of influence in the Middle East and look to other partners, in particular Russia, as other sources of support. I think one crucial thing is that his party, the AKP, is going to have to work in parliament with the MHP, which is an ultra-nationalist right-wing party that demands a very hard line against the Kurds, which will have two effects. One is that it can deepen existing divisions within Turkey, but also, remember, U.S. and NATO forces are supporting Kurdish enclaves across the border in Syria, and the U.S. government supports the Kurdish statelet, really, in northern Iraq. So to the extent that Erdogan needs to give a pound of flesh to the MHP on certain legislative issues, he may be pushed in an even more hawkish direction on the Kurds, which drives a further wedge between Istanbul and NATO. It's sort of a complicated story, but there we are.
I find it really fascinating when you discuss the rise to power of Erdogan and the idea of moving away from the seculars in the major cities and reaching out to more conservative, religious folks out in the Anatolian hinterlands. And I wonder, we're starting to see a lot of that across Europe and across the Mediterranean, where people who perhaps have started out as democratically minded leaders ultimately turn to this sort of conservatism, this hard right turn that they're making. And you say, yes, he only got 52% of the vote because it suggests that some of the institutions in Turkey are holding still. But when the president controls the media, when the president controls the military, when the president has sweeping powers that he's
changing the laws in his favor
by martial law, I mean, even if they have a little bit of agency, how long can it last?
Well, I think that's a really important question, because he takes over this presidency now with vastly expanded powers. He pushed through a referendum last year that makes the presidency really a super presidency, Turkey, eliminates the prime minister role, and really kind of makes the president the main guy. And the question is he going to use that power to really break these last kind of ramparts of resistance against his kind of neo-sultan idea of ruling Turkey, or is he going to push too far in a way that destabilizes Turkey further? I don't think we know where that story is going to go, but I think it's the critical one to watch.
And it certainly seems like he does have significant support from the population. I mean, you know, in reading about this story, you know, a lot of people are hoping that he will be able to sort of be there for the next generation. Right. That's an awful long time in power.
I mean, look, he brought people into Turkish politics, or it gave people a sense of enfranchisement in Turkish politics who had never had that before, right? For decades, these secular elites in Western Turkey ran the country, and he opened up the political sphere to millions of people who felt that they'd been marginalized. It's a story we've seen elsewhere,
yes.
not least here.
I'm just curious about how it will play out, not in next year, but in the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, you know, 25 years ago, 50 years ago, the United States made a concerted effort to condemn things that were anti-democratic, and now in the last 20 years or so, we've become increasingly inward-looking.